Ben sat quietly on the bus to Lincoln Heights, Missouri, his head resting against the window, eyes following the scenery passing by. The bustling city was fading into the distance, replaced by identical suburban streets, two-story houses with neatly trimmed lawns, as if they had been copied and pasted. This trip wasn't something he had wished for. He was no stranger to being the new kid, but this time, something felt different. His mother had landed a better job, and his uncle called it an opportunity to start fresh. But Ben knew new beginnings weren't easy, especially when he looked nothing like anyone in a town like this. Richmond High School came into view, a worn-down building with an imposing iron gate. As Ben stepped onto the campus, he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Conversations halted momentarily. Eyes flickered toward him before hastily looking away. Teachers smiled politely, too politely, their voices carrying a trace of carefulness. Ben didn't react. He was used to this. The first few classes passed uneventfully. He took his seat, answered when necessary, completed assignments without drawing attention. But by lunchtime, the feeling of being watched began to settle in. With a lunch tray in hand, Ben scanned the cafeteria. Most tables were full, students clustered together, laughing and chatting, except for him. Some whispered, stealing glances before smirking. Near the window, a lone student was absorbed in his phone, seemingly indifferent to everything around him. It was the only empty seat left. Ben moved toward it, but before he could set his tray down, a voice called out behind him, "Hey, new kid, need a map?" Ben turned. Standing in front of him was a blonde-haired guy, exuding confidence with a smirk that barely concealed arrogance. Behind him stood a small group, all watching Ben with a mix of amusement, as if he were their latest source of entertainment. Ben exhaled slowly. "No thanks." The blonde guy's smirk widened, arms crossing over his chest. "Didn't think so? Not a lot of fresh faces around here." He paused, eyes glinting with mock curiosity. "But I guess you're an exception." The group behind him chuckled, but Ben remained expressionless, his gaze steady. He had heard this before, in other towns, from people like him. "Name's Wiani," the blonde guy finally said, his smirk still firmly in place. "Welcome to Ridgemont." Ben said nothing. He simply sat down and picked up his fork. He didn't need their welcome, and he certainly didn't need their approval. But deep down, Ben knew this was just the beginning, and it wouldn't end here. The first few days at Richmond High passed in tense silence. Ben kept a low profile, making no effort to stand out or fit in. He simply did what he had to, attend class, complete assignments, and go home. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't escape the curious stares of the other students. It started like a gentle breeze, whispers in the hallway, judgmental glances, smirks laced with hidden meanings. But Ben was used to that. The first time he truly felt it was when he was retrieving a book from his locker. A sudden shove from behind sent him crashing into the metal door, the loud clang echoing through the hallway. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Oh, my bad. Didn't see you there." The arrogant voice rang out. Wiani Tanner leaned casually against the locker next to his, arms crossed, a smug grin playing on his lips. Behind him, his usual entourage, Nick and Kyle, stood watching, their faces alight with amusement, as if they were witnessing some private comedy show. Ben exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He shut his locker, his gaze steady on Weenie. He was testing him, waiting for a reaction. Some sign of fear, some excuse to escalate things. But Ben didn't give him that. Adjusting the strap of his backpack, he stepped past Wiani without a word. Wiani raised an eyebrow, looking momentarily surprised before chuckling. "Oh, silent treatment." "Nice. But you know, being too quiet gets boring real fast." Laughter erupted from his friends, but Ben was already gone, never looking back. The second time happened in the cafeteria. Ben was heading to the trash bin to throw away his milk carton when a foot suddenly stuck out in front of him. He barely saw it in time, but quick reflexes saved him from stumbling face first onto the floor. Laughter rang out behind him. "Relax, man. It's just a joke," Wiani said, holding his hands up in mock innocence. This time, Ben turned to face him. No anger, no fear, just silent, unwavering pressure. The cafeteria grew quieter as students stole glances at them, but Ben said nothing. He simply stepped past Weenie and moved on. Weenie chuckled, but something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, a hint of frustration. Ben knew this wasn't over, and the third time, it wouldn't just be a joke anymore. The schoolyard grew quieter as the afternoon dragged on. Students filtered out, some lingering in the parking lot, others walking toward the main gate. Ben took his time, staying in the library longer than usual, deliberately avoiding unnecessary attention. But as soon as he stepped beyond the school gates, that familiar feeling returned. "Hey there, new kid." The voice came from behind. Ben turned. Weenie Tanner stood by his car, holding a large soda in one hand. Flanking him, as always, were Nick and Kyle, both wearing their usual smirks. "Running late? Or were you trying to avoid us?" Wiani said, tilting the soda cup slightly, making the liquid inside swirl. Ben didn't respond immediately. He just observed. The tension in the air was unmistakable. This was no longer a joke. Wiani took a sip of his drink, then stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away. "You know, I don't like the way you look at me. It's challenging." He didn't wait for an answer. His hand flicked up, hurling the soda straight at Ben. But this time, Ben was ready. He shifted sideways, avoiding most of the liquid, though a few drops splattered onto his shoes. Laughter echoed from Nick and Kyle, but Wayani wasn't laughing. "Oh, you're quick," he said, narrowing his eyes. "But quick isn't always enough." And then he lunged. In that instant, the world seemed to slow. Ben didn't back away. He didn't flinch. Instead, he moved toward Wayani, meeting the punch head-on. He twisted his shoulder, absorbing the impact, then grabbed Wayani's wrist and yanked him forward. Thud! A sharp jab to the ribs sent Wayani stumbling. He staggered back, furious. "What the hell?" But Ben didn't wait. A left hook, fast, precise, unforgiving. Wayani's head snapped back, his body losing balance. He crashed onto the pavement. Silence. Nick and Kyle stood frozen. Across the parking lot, other students had stopped, watching in stunned silence. Ben said nothing. He simply looked down at Weenie, the boy now sprawled at his feet, eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Then he turned and walked away. No explanation, no regret. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The schoolyard emptied out, the last students trickling away, leaving the parking lot sparsely dotted with cars. Ben took his time. He stood outside the library, fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. He knew what was waiting for him out there, and just as expected, "Finally decided to come out, huh?" Wiani's voice rang out, laced with amusement. Ben turned to see him leaning against his car, Nick and Kyle flanking him as always. But this time, there were no mocking smirks, only a cold, silent challenge. Ben sighed. "What do you want?" Wiani scoffed. "Just clearing things up. You know, last time, you got a little too confident." Ben didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just stood still, meeting Wiani's glare without a flinch. Wiani stepped forward, slow but deliberate. "You think just because you got lucky once, it's over?" "No," Ben said simply, "but I'm not here to play your game." Wiani raised an eyebrow, then, without warning, swung. But Ben had already seen it coming. He shifted his weight, dodging the punch effortlessly, before twisting his body and delivering a clean left hook to Wiani's ribs. Thud. Wiani grunted, stumbling back, his face tightening with pain and fury. Nick and Kyle froze. They weren't laughing anymore. Wiani steadied himself, rage flashing in his eyes. He lunged again, harder this time. But Ben didn't wait. He stepped in, sweeping his leg low and knocking Wiani off balance. Before Wiani could react, Ben gave him a controlled shove to the shoulder, sending him stumbling back against his car. Clang! Wiani's back hit the door with a dull thud, his breathing ragged. But Ben didn't follow up. He just stood there, watching him. "Let it go, Wiani," Ben said calmly. "I have nothing to prove to you." Wiani clenched his jaw but said nothing. Finally, he turned away and slammed a fist against the car. Ben slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked off, leaving behind Wiani's seething glare and the heavy silence of those watching. He knew this wasn't over, but at least this time, he was the one walking away, without looking back. The school parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few scattered cars remaining as Ben stepped outside. The sky was tinged with soft hues of orange, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. Adjusting the strap of his backpack, Ben sensed something off in the air, and then that familiar voice rang out. "Hey there, took you long enough." Wiani leaned against his car, hands stuffed in his pockets, a smirk tugging at his lips. As always, Nick and Kyle flanked him. Ben stopped, unfazed. "Something you need?" Wiani shrugged. "Nothing serious. Just thought we should clear a few things up." Ben stayed silent. He knew guys like Wiani never let things go easily. Someone like him couldn't stand being embarrassed, especially not in front of his friends. And after what happened in the cafeteria and the hallway, Ben had left a dent in his pride. "You think just because you landed one lucky punch, you can walk around this school like some kind of king?" Wiani took a step forward, closing the distance. "You think you're special?" Ben exhaled slowly. "Number? But I'm also not someone you can push around whenever you feel like it." A brief silence, then suddenly, Wiani swung. Ben had seen it coming. He shifted to the side, the punch grazing past his face. Without hesitation, he struck back, a solid punch straight into Wiani's ribs. Thud! Wiani staggered back, breath hitching. He hadn't expected Ben to be that fast. Nick and Kyle exchanged glances, but didn't move. Gritting his teeth, Wiani lunged again, harder this time. But Ben was ready. He lowered his stance, angled his shoulder, and redirected Wiani's charge. Wiani stumbled, struggling to regain his balance, and the moment he did, smack! Ben landed a sharp right hook to Wiani's jaw. The impact sent Wiani crashing onto the pavement. Silence. Nick and Kyle froze. The few students lingering in the distance held their breath. Wiani lay sprawled on the ground, one hand clutching his jaw, eyes wide with shock. But he didn't get up. Ben inhaled deeply, straightened his jacket, then looked down at him. "Done?" Wiani clenched his teeth but didn't answer. Ben didn't wait. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked away. This time, he didn't have to look back. He had won. News of the parking lot confrontation spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The next morning, as Ben walked into school, he could feel the shift in the air. Every pair of eyes was on him, but it wasn't the same cautious curiosity from his first day at Ridgemont. It was something different, a kind of acknowledgement. Some students gave him silent nods as he passed. Others whispered to each other, their eyes filled with surprise and, perhaps, a hint of respect. But not everyone felt the same. Across the hallway, a small group of students murmured among themselves, one of them throwing a disapproving glance in Ben's direction. He caught a faint remark. Just another thug. Ben didn't turn his head. He didn't care. As he stepped into the classroom, the hushed conversation softened, but never completely faded. He took his seat, opened his book, and acted as if nothing had happened. But just as the lesson began, the door swung open. Wiani walked in. A faint bruise was visible on his cheek, but gone was his usual smug expression. Instead, he was silent. Nobody spoke. The entire class held its breath. Ben waited for some kind of reaction, a glare, a threat, anything, but instead, Wiani only glanced at him once, then walked straight to his seat. No words. Ben wasn't sure what that meant. In the days that followed, things gradually settled. Wiani didn't bother him again. Nick and Kyle kept their distance. No more unexpected shoves in the hallway. No more snide remarks at lunch. But that didn't mean it was truly over. One afternoon, as Ben was leaving the gym, a voice called from behind him. Ben! He turned around. Coach Maury, the school's wrestling coach, stood with his arms crossed. Listen, he said, his gaze sharp. I know what happened with you and Wiani. Ben shrugged. Everyone does. Maury nodded. The thing is, I've seen guys like you before. Fast, strong, skilled at fighting. But the real question isn't whether you can beat someone. It's what you're going to do with that strength. Ben remained silent. Maury motioned toward the training area. I talked to the boxing coach. I need a few guys with real potential on the team. You interested? Ben blinked. He had never considered that before. Why should I? He asked. Maury smirked, not a condescending smirk, but one of genuine confidence. Because you're capable of more than just throwing a punch. Ben looked down at his hands. He thought back to the moment his fist had connected with Wayne's face, the surge of anger burning in his chest. Was that really the path he wanted to take? Finally, he lifted his head, meeting Maury's gaze. All right, he said. And in that moment, Ben realized this was no longer just about one fight. This was about learning to control his own power. The next day, Ben walked into school and sensed something different. People weren't just whispering about him anymore. There were no more wary or mocking glances. Instead, there was a quiet kind of respect that had settled in the hallways. Wiani had returned. He sat silently at a table in the cafeteria, no longer smirking, no longer the center of attention. Nick and Kyle, too, had lost their usual arrogance. They weren't mocking Ben anymore, nor were they looking for ways to provoke him. But instead of feeling victorious, Ben only felt an odd emptiness. Violence had never been the answer. That afternoon, Coach Maury called him to the wrestling gym. Ben, have you thought about my offer? Maury asked, arms crossed. Ben glanced around. The wrestlers were practicing on the mats, moving with precision, each technique calculated and controlled. He remembered the moment his fist connected with Wayani's jaw, the power in his hands. But he also remembered the way people looked at him the next day, a mix of fear and respect. I'm not sure, Ben admitted slowly. Maury smiled. You're not sure if you want to be a fighter, right? Ben nodded. But you've always been fighting, Maury continued. You fight to protect yourself. You fight to make sure you're not stepped on. But fighting isn't just about throwing punches. It's about knowing when not to. The words echoed in Ben's mind. Control. All his life, he had been forced into situations where he had to push back. He had to be strong. But he had never thought about turning that strength into something else. Ben sighed. So what will I learn from wrestling? Maury's smile widened. You'll learn that true strength isn't about the hardest punch. It's about knowing when to use it, knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Ben looked down at his hands. This wasn't just about a fight in the parking lot. This was about his future. He lifted his gaze, meeting Maury's eyes, and nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a shot." Maury patted his shoulder, a satisfied grin on his face. "Welcome to the team." And just like that, Ben realized he had stepped onto a new path, one where he could finally take control. Rumors spread throughout the school. No longer were people whispering about the new kid getting bullied. Now, they talked about the one who stood up, fought back, and silenced Wiani in front of the entire parking lot. But even though Ben had won that battle, he knew the story wasn't over. At lunchtime, he walked into the cafeteria as usual. This time, though, instead of mocking glances, people avoided his eyes. Some looked at him with respect, others with caution. Conversations lowered to hushed whispers. He could feel it. He was no longer seen as an outsider. But did that mean he had been accepted? Or was it just fear shifting his place in the school? Ben sat alone in a quiet corner, saying nothing. A few unfamiliar faces nodded at him in acknowledgement, but no one approached. Then, suddenly, a voice spoke from behind him. "Sitting alone?" He looked up. It was Maury. Ben shrugged. "Seems like it." Maury pulled out a chair across from him, setting his water bottle on the table. "Listen, I've seen plenty of guys like Weenie in my life, guys who only know how to use their strength to control others. But do you know the difference between them and you?" Ben met his gaze, remaining silent. "They use strength to dominate," Maury continued. "But you have a chance to use your strength for something better." Ben sighed, leaning back in his chair. "So what? You think I should be the school's protector now?" Maury chuckled. "Number, you don't need to be a hero. But you can decide how to use your strength. If you keep fighting, people will never see you as just another student. They'll only see you as a fighter." His words made Ben pause. He recalled the whispers that morning, the cautious stares. No one really understood him. They only remembered his fists. Maury stood up, adjusting his jacket. "You can live as a legend in schoolyard fights, or you can prove you're stronger than guys like Weenie in a different way. The choice is yours." Then he walked away, leaving Ben alone with his thoughts. Ben looked down at his hands, hands that had only known fists, only known resistance. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to choose a different path, a path he could control. Ben walked through the school hallway, feeling the eyes on him, but this time they were no longer filled with ridicule or disdain. Instead, they held a mix of curiosity, admiration, and even a hint of caution. The rumors about his fight with Wayani had spread everywhere, and though Ben never wanted to stand out in this way, the reality was unavoidable. The gym doors swung open as he stepped inside. Coach Maury stood in the center of the mat, arms crossed, his sharp gaze watching the students practicing wrestling. When he noticed Ben, he gave a slight nod, signaling him to come closer. "You called me?" Ben asked, his voice steady. Maury studied him for a few seconds before gesturing toward a pair of students grappling on the mat. "What do you see?" Ben frowned slightly, observing them closely. They weren't throwing wild punches like in a street fight. Every movement was calculated. They weren't just using strength. They were using strategy, patience, and observation to gain the advantage. "Control," Ben answered after a moment. Maury smirked. "Exactly. Strength alone doesn't win fights. Real strength is knowing how to control it." Ben crossed his arms, thinking for a moment. "So, you're saying I should join the wrestling team?" Maury shrugged. "Not because I told you to, but because you know it's what you need." Ben took a deep breath, turning to watch the students train. Ever since he was a child, he had always been forced to hold back his anger, hold back against injustice, hold back to avoid giving others an excuse to misjudge him. But as he stood there, among people channeling their strength with discipline and purpose, he realized it was time to stop running from himself. He turned back to Maury and gave a firm nod. "I'll give it a shot." Maury grinned. "Good, because you're not just strong when you know how to fight. You're even stronger when you know how to use that strength the right way." Ben stepped toward the mat, feeling a new energy surge through him. This time, he wasn't fighting to survive. This time, he was fighting to become a better version of himself. That afternoon, Ben stood inside the gym, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wrestling mats. The rhythmic sound of heavy breathing echoed through the space as students trained, their movements precise and controlled. He had never imagined himself here, let alone considering joining the school's wrestling team. But his conversation with Maury the day before had given him something to think about. All his life, Ben had tried to avoid conflict, yet he had been forced into it more times than he could count. His fight with Wayani wasn't the first time he had been pushed to his limit, but it was the first time he realized that fighting back didn't make things better. It only left him with wary glances, hushed whispers, and an emptiness he couldn't seem to fill. From across the gym, Maury watched him, arms crossed. Sensing Ben's hesitation, he approached, his voice calm as if he had already anticipated this moment. "Still thinking it over?" Maury asked. Ben let out a slow breath. "I'm not sure. I've never thought about wrestling before. I just want to be left alone." Maury chuckled lightly. "Do you think the people here don't want that too? Everyone has a reason to fight. Some want to prove themselves. Some want to learn to defend themselves. And some just want to control their strength before it controls them." Ben remained silent. Those words struck exactly what had been circling in his mind since last night. Maury continued, "Do you know why I want you to join? It's not because you're strong, it's because you have the potential to control it. I've seen too many kids like you, powerful but unsure of what to do with it. You can become an untouchable warrior or a wild beast with no control. The choice is yours." Ben took a deep breath, looking over at the students training. They weren't fighting like people did in the streets. They weren't battling to overpower others. Every move was calculated, intentional, and controlled. "All right," Ben said, his voice firmer now. "I'll give it a shot." Maury nodded approvingly. "Good, because a true warrior isn't just someone who knows how to win, but someone who knows which battles are worth fighting." Ben stepped onto the mat, feeling a shift within himself. This wasn't just about proving he was strong. It was about learning to use his strength the right way. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally walking a path he had chosen for himself. Lesson from the story: life isn't always fair, and sometimes we are thrown into situations we never asked for. But what truly matters is not how we are treated, but how we choose to respond. Ben could have kept fighting back with violence or simply avoided trouble altogether. But in the end, he realized that real strength isn't in throwing punches, it's in control. Sometimes knowing when to fight and what to fight for is more important than just winning. Instead of letting anger and social pressure define him, Ben chose a different path: to discipline himself and grow stronger, not just physically, but mentally. His story teaches us that strength isn't about dominating others, but about resilience, courage, and self-control. In the end, the one who can control themselves is the one who is truly strong. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.